The town of Copper Falls had grown accustomed to whispers, but none more persistent than those about the boy who lived behind the general store. 8-year-old Thomas, nobody knew his last name, moved through the settlement like a ghost, his 2 dark eyes taking in everything while revealing nothing. "That child ain't natural," Martha Henley would mutter to anyone who'd listen, clutching her shawl tighter whenever Thomas appeared. "Came from nowhere, speaks to no one. Mark my words, there's something wrong with him." The boy had arrived 3 winters ago in the back of a supply wagon, half frozen and completely silent. The driver claimed he'd found Thomas wandering alone on the prairie, but offered no other details. Since then, he'd survived on scraps and charity, sleeping in the storeroom behind Henderson's general store in exchange for sweeping floors and stacking crates. Thomas understood why people feared him. He looked different, skin darker than most, hair black as midnight, and those eyes that seemed to see too much. He'd learned early that silence was safer than speaking, that shadows were kinder than daylight, that being forgotten was better than being noticed. But today, as he swept the store's front porch, Thomas couldn't ignore the commotion building at the far end of Main Street. A small crowd had gathered around a tall man in a faded blue uniform, a Union soldier, his insignia barely visible on worn fabric. "Name Sergeant William Hayes," the soldier was telling Mayor Collins. "I'm heading north to Fort Benton, just need supplies for the journey." Thomas paused in his sweeping, drawn by something in the soldier's voice, a tiredness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. The man's shoulders carried more weight than his travel pack, and his eyes held the same careful emptiness that Thomas saw in his own reflection. "We can fix you up with what you need," Mayor Collins replied, though his tone carried an edge. "Question is what brings a Union man through these parts? War's been over near 14 years. Sergeant Hayes's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Some wars take longer to end than others, Mayor." As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas noticed something that made his stomach clench with familiar dread. The soldier was loading his horse methodically, checking his rifle, adjusting his gear. All the preparations of a man planning to leave before dawn. Thomas had seen those preparations before. His mother had made them the night before she disappeared forever, packing her few belongings with the same careful attention while he pretended to sleep. That evening, as Copper Falls settled into its usual quiet routine, Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of retreating to his corner of the storeroom, he slipped out into the night and walked toward the small camp Sergeant Hayes had made at the edge of town. The soldier sat by a modest fire, staring into the flames with the intensity of a man searching for answers that wouldn't come. He looked up sharply when Thomas emerged from the darkness, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm before recognizing the small figure. "You're the boy from the store," Hayes said, his voice neither welcoming nor hostile. "Shouldn't you be asleep?" Thomas stood at the edge of the firelight, gathering courage he didn't know he possessed. Tomorrow this man would leave like everyone else eventually did. Tomorrow Thomas would be alone again with his shadows and his silence. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, he found his voice. What words could a forgotten child speak that would matter to a man who'd forgotten himself? Thomas stood in the flickering firelight, his small frame trembling not from cold but from the effort of breaking 3 years of carefully maintained silence. Sergeant Hayes studied the boy with the same careful attention he'd once used to assess battlefield threats, noting the tension in those thin shoulders, the way dark eyes reflected flame and fear in equal measure. "Well?" Hayes asked quietly. "You came all this way. Might as well speak your piece." The words felt foreign on Thomas's tongue, rusty from disuse except for the bare necessities of daily survival. I watch people," he began hesitantly. "They come, they go. They always go." Hayes's expression softened slightly, recognizing something universal in the boy's simple observation. "That's the way of things, son. People move on, got their own lives to live. But you're different," Thomas said, taking a small step closer to the fire. "You're not running to something. You're running from something." The words hit their mark. Hayes's face hardened, walls sliding back into place. "You don't know anything about me, boy." "I know you wake up scared," Thomas continued, his voice gaining strength. "I hear you sometimes when the dreams come. I know because I have them too." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. Hayes stared at this strange child who somehow saw through his carefully constructed facade. "My mama used to pack her things just like you did today," Thomas said. his voice barely above a whisper. Real careful, real quiet. She said she'd come back, but she never did. I waited by the window for months, watching that road. Hayes felt something crack inside his chest, a pain he'd spent years burying beneath duty and determination. That's hard, son. But people leave for all kinds of reasons. What's your reason? Thomas asked with the brutal honesty only children possessed. The question should have been easy to deflect. Hayes had deflected it from fellow soldiers, from well-meaning townspeople, from his own commanding officers. But something about this boy's unwavering gaze made lies impossible. I killed a man who didn't deserve to die, Hayes said finally, the words scraping his throat raw. War was supposed to be over, but we got bad orders. Attacked a village that was flying a white flag. When I saw what we'd done, I couldn't stay. Couldn't be that kind of soldier anymore. Thomas nodded as if this confession made perfect sense. So you're looking for some place where it doesn't hurt anymore. Something like that. But you won't find it, Thomas said with startling certainty. My mama taught me that. The hurt comes with you wherever you go. Only thing that makes it better is having someone who understands. Hayes looked down at this unlikely philosopher. This child who'd been abandoned by the world yet somehow retained wisdom that had eluded him for years. Is that what you came to tell me? Thomas shook his head. I came to ask you something. He stepped fully into the firelight now, his face illuminated by dancing flames. For the first time, Hayes could see past the fear and strangeness others talked about. He saw intelligence in those dark eyes, resilience in the set of those small shoulders, and something else. Hope, carefully guarded but still burning. Please don't go, Thomas said simply. I know you don't owe me nothing. I know I'm just some strange kid everybody's scared of, but maybe we could be scared together instead of alone. The plea hit Hayes like a physical blow. In all his years of war and wandering, no one had ever asked him to stay. No one had ever suggested that his presence might matter, might be wanted. Thomas, and he began, then stopped, realizing he'd never actually learned the boy's name. Just Thomas, the boy confirmed. Never had a last name, or if I did, I can't remember it. Hayes stared into the fire, feeling the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. He'd been running for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to be asked to stay. The fire burned low between them as Sergeant Hayes wrestled with a decision he'd never expected to face. Across the glowing embers, Thomas waited with the patience of someone who'd learned that pushing rarely brought good results. You understand what you're asking? Hayes said finally. I'm not the kind of man who's good with children. Haven't been around families in years. I'm not asking you to be my pa, Thomas replied with startling directness. I'm asking you not to leave me behind again. The word again carried years of abandonment, and Hayes felt its weight settle in his chest. He'd been abandoned too, in different ways, by his country when the war ended and left him purposeless, by his fellow soldiers when he'd spoken out against their actions, by his own sense of honor when he'd failed to prevent tragedy. Where would we go? Hayes asked, and immediately regretted the question. It implied he was considering the boy's request, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that. Thomas's eyes brightened slightly. You said you were heading to Fort Benton. I heard tell there's homestead land up that way. Good farming country? I'm not a farmer, Thomas. I'm a soldier. It's all I know. War's over, Thomas said simply. Maybe it's time to learn something new. Hayes stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the firelight. The boy made it sound so simple, but nothing about starting over was simple. You don't understand the kind of man I am. The things I've done. You think I never done bad things? Thomas interrupted. You think being alone for 3 years don't change a person? I stole food when I was hungry. I lied when it kept me safe. I let people think I was strange and scary because it meant they left me alone. Hayes turned back to study the boy's face. In the dying firelight, Thomas looked older than his 8 years, marked by experiences no child should carry. But you're not a bad person, Thomas continued. Bad people don't have nightmares about what they've done. Bad people don't run away when they realize they hurt someone. They just keep hurting. The observation was so perceptive it took Hayes's breath away. How do you know so much about people, son? When you're invisible, you see everything, Thomas said matter-of-factly. You learn to read faces to know who's safe and who ain't. You're safe. Hurt, but safe. Hayes sat back down, closer to the boy this time. If I was to consider this crazy idea, what makes you think it would work? 2 broken people trying to build something from nothing? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying flames. My mama used to tell me stories about broken things, he said finally. Said sometimes when something breaks, it gets stronger when you put it back together. Like a bone that heals or a pot that's been mended with gold. Japanese call that kintsugi, Hayes said without thinking. Thomas looked up in surprise. You know about that? Met a Japanese fellow in San Francisco once. He was fixing a broken bowl with gold powder. Said it made the bowl more beautiful than before. That the cracks told a story worth preserving? Maybe that's what we could be, Thomas said softly. Two broken things held together with something stronger than what broke us. Hayes felt tears prick his eyes, the first he'd shed since that terrible day at the village. This strange, wise child was offering him something he'd thought was lost forever. The chance to matter to someone. The possibility of redemption through connection rather than isolation. There's a homestead office in Fort Benton, Hayes said slowly. They're giving land to veterans willing to work it. 160 acres if you can prove it up in 5 years. That sounds like a lot of land for 2 people to manage. It is, Hayes agreed. Take a lot of work. A lot of learning. A lot of patience with each other. Thomas's smile was small but genuine, the first Hayes had seen from him. I'm good at being patient. Had lots of practice. Hayes extended his hand toward the boy. Partners then? Until you're old enough to decide you want something different? Thomas gripped the offered hand with both of his smaller ones. Partners, he agreed solemnly. As they shook hands over the dying fire, both felt something shift inside them. Walls coming down, hope cautiously unfurling. The first fragile threads of trust beginning to weave between 2 souls who'd forgotten they were worth saving. The next morning brought curious stares and whispered conversations as Sergeant Hayes and Thomas prepared to leave Copper Falls together. Hayes had spent the dawn hours purchasing additional supplies, warmer clothes for Thomas, extra food, and a small saddle that would allow the boy to ride safely. You sure about this, Sergeant? Mayor Collins asked, unable to hide his skepticism. That boy's been nothing but trouble since he arrived. Strange doesn't begin to cover it. Hayes adjusted Thomas's new coat, the first that had ever been bought specifically for him, and met the mayor's gaze steadily. Strange how? Because he's quiet? Because he keeps to himself? Seems to me those are smart survival skills, not character flaws. Martha Henley approached with the cluster of women who'd made Thomas's life difficult, through 3 years of whispered fears and deliberate exclusion. Sergeant, that child has never spoken more than 2 words together since he's been here. How do you even know he's normal? Thomas, who'd been silently loading supplies onto Hayes's pack horse, looked up at the woman who'd been particularly cruel in her avoidance of him. I can speak, Mrs. Henley. I just never had anything to say that you'd want to hear. The simple statement, delivered without malice but with devastating clarity, left the women speechless. Hayes felt a surge of protective pride for this remarkable boy who'd endured years of rejection with such dignity. We'll be fine, Hayes told the gathering crowd. Thomas here's got more sense than most adults I've known. We'll make good partners. As they rode out of Copper Falls, Thomas looked back only once at the town that had sheltered but never embraced him. Do you think they'll talk about us after we're gone? Probably, Hayes replied. People always talk about things they don't understand. Question is, do you care what they say? Thomas considered this seriously. I used to care. Wanted them to like me so bad it hurt. But they never tried to know me, so their opinions don't mean much. The wisdom in such a young voice still amazed Hayes. That's a hard lesson to learn at any age. What about you? Thomas asked. You care what people think? Hayes was quiet for a mile before answering. Used to care too much. What my commanding officers thought, what other soldiers thought, what the folks back home would think of what I'd done in the war. Nearly drove me crazy trying to be what everyone else wanted. What changed? You did, Hayes said simply. Last night when you asked me to stay, first time in years someone wanted me for who I am, not what I could do for them or what uniform I wore. They traveled through country that grew more beautiful and challenging with each mile. Montana's landscape rolled out before them in waves of endless possibility. Vast prairies giving way to distant mountains, streams that promised good water for farming, stands of timber that could build a lifetime of homes. On their second day of travel, they encountered their first real test. A group of 5 men rode up from behind, overtaking them at a crossroads. Their leader, a man with cold eyes and an expensive hat, looked Hayes and Thomas over with obvious calculation. "Afternoon," the man said, his tone pleasant but somehow threatening. "Name's Crawford. Me and my boys are heading north too. Wondered if you might have heard anything about the homestead claims up Fort Benton way." Hayes sensed danger in the question but kept his voice neutral. "Heard they're available to qualified applicants. Veterans get preference, that so?" Crawford's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Wouldn't want some folks getting land that rightfully belongs to others. If you catch my meaning." His gaze lingered meaningfully on Thomas, and Hayes felt anger surge through him. The implication was clear. These men didn't believe someone like Thomas belonged on homestead land. "I catch your meaning," Hayes said quietly, his hand moving casually closer to his sidearm. "Question is, what makes you think you know who land rightfully belongs to?" The tension stretched between the two groups like a taut wire. Thomas, sensing the danger, moved his horse closer to Hayes, not hiding, but showing solidarity. Crawford seemed to weigh his options, then apparently decided discretion was wiser than confrontation with an armed veteran. "Just making conversation, friend. Safe travels." As the men rode away, Thomas looked up at Hayes with new understanding. "They don't think I belong anywhere, do they?" "They're wrong," Hayes said firmly. "Land doesn't care what color your skin is or where you came from. It only cares if you're willing to work it and care for it." "Is that really true?" Hayes met the boy's searching gaze. "It's going to be true for us. I promise you that." Fort Benton sprawled along the Missouri River like a promise half kept, part military outpost, part trading center, part launching point for dreams that might or might not survive the harsh Montana winters. Hayes and Thomas rode into town on a crisp afternoon, their horses tired but their spirits cautiously hopeful. The homestead office occupied a small building near the river, its windows covered with maps showing available land parcels. A line of prospective settlers waited outside. Families with children, single men with calloused hands, even a few women who'd come west to claim their own piece of the frontier. "You nervous?" Thomas asked as they joined the line. "Little bit," Hayes admitted. "Been a long time since I tried to build something instead of tear it down." The clerk inside the office was a thin man named Peterson, who processed applications with methodical efficiency. When their turn came, he looked up from his paperwork with the weary expression of someone who'd heard every hard luck story the territory could offer. "Name?" he asked Hayes. "William Hayes, Sergeant. Recently discharged from the 7th Infantry." Peterson's manner brightened slightly at the military connection. "Good, veterans get first choice on parcels. You got your discharge papers?" Hayes produced the documents he'd carried for months, waiting for the right moment to use them. Peterson examined them carefully, then looked at Thomas with curiosity. "This your boy?" Hayes felt Thomas tense beside him. They'd discussed this moment during their journey, deciding that honesty, carefully presented, was their best approach. "Thomas is my ward," Hayes said. "I've taken responsibility for his care and upbringing." "Any documentation of the arrangement?" "Thomas was orphaned and had no legal guardian. I'm prepared to file the necessary papers to make it official." Peterson studied Thomas with the calculating eye of a man who'd learned to spot trouble before it started. Thomas met his gaze steadily, neither defiant nor submissive, just present and unashamed. "Boy's got some Indian blood in him," Peterson observed. "Thomas is American," Hayes said firmly, "same as anyone else looking to make an honest living on honest land. Now, Sergeant, don't get your hackles up. Just noting what I see might affect which parcels are available." Hayes felt anger building in his chest, but Thomas's small hand on his arm reminded him to stay calm. Getting thrown out of the homestead office wouldn't help anyone. "What exactly are you saying, Mr. Peterson?" "Some areas got neighbors who might not take kindly to diversity. For everyone's safety, might be better to look at more isolated parcels." Hayes studied the map on the wall, seeing the subtle segregation Peterson was describing. The best land, closest to town and transportation, was apparently reserved for families who looked like they belonged. "Show me what you've got," Hayes said finally. Peterson pointed to a section marked in blue, about 20 miles northwest of Fort Benton. "Got a 160-acre plot up here. Good water, decent soil, some timber. Previous claimant couldn't prove it up, so it's available again." "Why couldn't he prove it up?" "Winters are hard out there, real hard. Takes a special kind of person to stick it out." Hayes looked down at Thomas, seeing determination in those dark eyes. "What do you think, partner? Think we're special enough?" Thomas studied the map carefully, noting the distance from neighbors, the isolation that could be either safety or danger depending on perspective. Looks like it's got everything we need. Water, trees, space to grow things. Hard to get to town for supplies, Peterson warned. Good, Thomas said quietly. Maybe that means folks will be too busy with their own business to worry about ours. Peterson seemed surprised by the boy's insight. You might be right about that, son. An hour later, they walked out of the office with signed papers that made them legal owners of 160 acres of Montana territory, provided they could live on it, improve it, and prove it up within 5 years. We did it, Hayes said as they stood by their horses. We actually did it. Thomas looked at the papers in Hayes's hands, the first official documents that had ever included his name as belonging somewhere, to someone. Now what? Now we go see our land, Hayes said. Then we figure out how to turn it into home. As they mounted their horses and headed northwest toward their new life, neither man nor boy looked back toward Fort Benton. The future was ahead of them, uncertain but filled with possibility. The ride to their homestead took them through country that seemed carved by God's own hand. Rolling hills dotted with aspens whose leaves caught the afternoon light like scattered gold coins, and beyond them the distant peaks of the Rocky Mountains standing sentinel against an endless sky. There, Hayes said, consulting the crude map Peterson had drawn for them. That creek up ahead should mark our eastern boundary. They crossed the water at a shallow ford, their horses' hooves splashing through clear current that ran over smooth stones. On the far side, the land opened into a natural meadow surrounded by stands of pine and cottonwood. Exactly the kind of place Hayes had dreamed about during long, sleepless nights in Army barracks. How do we know where our land ends? Thomas asked, looking around at the unmarked wilderness. See that big pine with the lightning scar? That's our northeast corner according to the map. Southwest corner should be that rock outcrop about a mile that way. Hayes pointed toward a distinctive formation that jutted from the hillside like a giant's thumb. They spent the next 2 hours riding the rough boundaries of their claim. And with each mile, Hayes felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. The sense that he belonged somewhere, that this place could become truly his. Thomas seemed equally affected by the land. He rode quietly, but Hayes could see him cataloging details, the best spots for a garden, where the sun lingered longest, how the wind patterns might affect a house placed in different locations. What do you think? Hayes asked as they paused on a small rise that offered a view of their entire property. It's beautiful, Thomas said simply, but it's going to be a lot of work. That it is. Question is, where do we start? Thomas pointed toward a spot where the creek curved close to a grove of mature cottonwoods. There. Good water, trees for shade in summer and windbreak in winter. High enough to avoid flooding, but close enough to the creek that we won't have to carry water far. Hayes followed the boy's pointing finger and nodded approvingly. Good eye. That's exactly what I was thinking. They made camp that first night under stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than any Hayes remembered from his Army days. Thomas proved surprisingly capable at outdoor living, gathering firewood, helping prepare their simple meal, bedding down in his blankets without complaint about the hard ground. Tell me about your ma, Hayes said as they lay listening to the creek's gentle murmur. What was she like? Thomas was quiet for so long Hayes thought he'd fallen asleep. Then in a voice barely above a whisper he began to speak. She sang all the time. Didn't matter if she was cooking or mending or just walking. There was always music coming from her. Said singing kept the sadness away. What happened to her? Don't know for sure. We were traveling with a wagon train, heading west to meet my pa who'd gone ahead to find work. One morning she just wasn't there anymore. Her things were gone, but she left me this. Thomas pulled a small object from inside his shirt, a wooden carving of a bird with its wings spread. Carved it herself. Said it was a meadowlark, and that no matter where I ended up when I heard one sing, I'd know she was thinking about me. Hayes felt his throat tighten. That's a beautiful thing to leave you. I used to think it meant she was coming back. Now I think maybe she knew she couldn't take care of me anymore. Maybe leaving me was the kindest thing she could do. The mature wisdom in such a young voice broke Hayes's heart. You don't have to understand it all right now, Thomas. Sometimes adults make choices that don't make sense until you're older. What about you? You got family somewhere? Hayes stared up at the star-filled sky. Had a wife once, Sarah. She couldn't wait for me to come back from the war. Found someone else, someone who was there when she needed him. That hurt, like nothing I'd ever felt. But I understand it now. War changes people. I wasn't the same man who left, and she deserved someone who could give her a whole heart. They lay in comfortable silence after that. Two people who'd been abandoned for different reasons, but who'd somehow found each other. Above them, a nightbird called softly from the cottonwoods. Not a meadowlark, but close enough to feel like a blessing. Tomorrow they would begin the enormous task of building a life from nothing but hope and determination. Tonight it was enough to lie under their own sky on their own land, no longer alone. The first snowfall came in early October, just 6 weeks after Hayes and Thomas had broken ground on their cabin. They'd managed to get the walls up and the roof mostly finished, but the gaps between the logs still needed chinking, and their door was nothing more than a heavy canvas tarp weighted with stones. Good thing we started with the barn, Hayes said, watching Thomas feed their horses in the sturdy shelter they'd built first. They'd learned from Peterson that animals were the difference between surviving Montana winters and not surviving them at all. Horses are happier than we are, Thomas observed, his breath forming white clouds in the morning air. At 9 years old, he'd grown 2 inches since their arrival and gained 15 pounds of muscle from the constant physical work of homesteading. Their cabin was small, just one room, with a stone fireplace and a sleeping loft Hayes had built for Thomas, but it was solid, constructed with the same methodical care Hayes had once applied to military engineering projects. Every log was fitted precisely. Every joint was sound, every detail planned for maximum efficiency. We need to get to town for winter supplies, Hayes said, consulting their carefully maintained list. Salt, flour, sugar, ammunition. Maybe some books for you. Thomas looked up from mucking stalls. Books? Can't have you growing up without learning to read properly. Your ma would have wanted that. Over the months, Hayes had discovered that Thomas could read basic words but had never had formal education. Evening lessons by firelight had become part of their routine, with Hayes teaching arithmetic, geography, and anything else he could remember from his own scattered schooling. The trip to Fort Benton took them past several other homesteads, and Hayes was pleased to see smoke rising from chimneys and signs of successful establishment. Their nearest neighbor, a German immigrant named Klaus Müller, had even waved from his field when they passed. But in town, they encountered a familiar and unwelcome face. Crawford, the man who'd confronted them on the trail months earlier, was holding court outside the saloon with several rough-looking companions. Well, look what we have here, Crawford called out as Hayes and Thomas hitched their horses outside the general store. The soldier and his pet Indian. How's that homestead working out for you? Hayes kept his voice level. Just fine, thanks for asking. That's good to hear. Really good. Because I've been talking to some folks and there's concern about property values in the area. Having certain elements around can affect what land's worth, if you catch my meaning. Thomas stepped closer to Hayes, not from fear but to show unity. Hayes felt proud of the boy's courage in the face of obvious hostility. The only thing affecting property values around here is the quality of work people put into their land, Hayes replied. Far as I can see, we're doing our part. Crawford's smile turned nasty. For now, maybe. But winter's coming, soldier. Winter changes things. Makes people realize who really belongs out here and who doesn't. The threat was clear enough, but before Hayes could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. Crawford. Sheriff Morrison, no relation to Jake from Hayes's memories, stepped out of the barbershop across the street. These folks causing you trouble? No trouble, Sheriff, Crawford replied smoothly. Just welcoming our new neighbors. Sheriff Morrison looked between the groups with the practiced eye of a man who'd broken up countless confrontations. Mr. Hayes, isn't it? How's the homestead coming along? Well enough, Sheriff. Just in town for winter supplies. Good to hear, Crawford. I believe you and your boys have some business to attend to elsewhere. It wasn't quite an order, but Crawford clearly understood the sheriff's meaning. Of course, Sheriff. Just being neighborly. As the men dispersed, Sheriff Morrison approached Hayes and Thomas. Might want to be careful around that one. Crawford's been making noise about homestead allocations, claiming some folks got land that should have gone to more suitable families. What's he planning to do about it? Hayes asked. Probably nothing legal, just watch yourselves out there. Winter can be hard enough without adding human problems to natural ones. That evening, as they loaded their wagon with supplies, Thomas was unusually quiet. Finally, as they prepared to leave town, he spoke up. Are we really safe out there? Just the two of us? Hayes considered lying, offering false reassurance, but Thomas deserved honesty. Safe as we can make ourselves. We've got good walls, plenty of ammunition, and neighbors who seem decent. But you're right to be concerned. We'll need to be careful. If something happens to you, what happens to me? The question hit Hayes like a physical blow. In all their planning and building, he'd never fully considered the precarious nature of Thomas's position. The boy had no legal family, no fallback plan if Hayes was killed or injured. Nothing's going to happen to me, Hayes said. But just in case, I've been writing letters to my brother in California. He's a good man, has a family. If something ever did happen, you'd have somewhere to go. Thomas nodded solemnly. But I'd rather stay with you. I'd rather that too, partner. So let's make sure we both make it through whatever winter throws at us. As their wagon rolled through the gathering dusk toward home, both man and boy understood that the hardest tests of their partnership still lay ahead. The storm that would test everything Hayes and Thomas had built together arrived 3 days before Christmas. At 8, it came without warning, a wall of white that transformed their familiar landscape into an alien world of howling, wind, and blinding snow. Hayes woke in the pre-dawn darkness to the sound of their cabin groaning under the assault of wind that seemed determined to tear their home apart. Above him in the loft, he could hear Thomas stirring restlessly. Hayes, the boy called softly, I'm here. Just a storm passing through. But as the hours dragged on, it became clear this was no ordinary storm. The wind never let up. The snow fell in sheets so thick they couldn't see their barn just 50 yards away. And the temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of their windows despite the roaring fire. On the second day, their chimney began backing up, filling the cabin with smoke that forced them to extinguish their fire and huddle together under every blanket they owned. This is bad, isn't it? Thomas asked, his teeth chattering despite being wrapped in 3 quilts. It's challenging, Hayes admitted, but we're prepared. We've got food, fuel, and shelter. We just need to outlast it. By the 3rd day, Hayes began to worry about their animals. The barn was sturdy, but without heat. Their horses and the milk cow they'd acquired in the fall were suffering. Worse, their water supply was running low because the pump had frozen solid. I need to check on the animals, Hayes told Thomas, and see if I can get some water from the creek. I'm coming with you. Too dangerous. If something happens to both of us. If something happens to you, it happens to me anyway, Thomas said with the stark logic that still amazed Hayes. We're partners. We face things together. They bundled up in every piece of warm clothing they owned and ventured into the storm connected by a rope Hayes had tied between them. The 50-yard journey to the barn felt like crossing an Arctic wasteland, but they made it to find their animals cold but alive. Working together, they managed to get water to the animals and spread additional straw for warmth. It was exhausting work in the brutal cold, but when they finally made it back to the cabin, Hayes felt a deep pride in what they'd accomplished together. That night, as they shared their meager fire and a simple meal of beans and hardtack, Thomas asked the question that had been haunting them both.